The candles went first. 10,000 of them, lit hours before the ceremony began, throwing gold across marble pillars and bowed heads, and the front pew where the Devereux family sat in their finest, wearing the settled ease of people who believed the hardest work was already behind them. The scent of beeswax and crushed lily hung thick enough to taste. Somewhere above the transept, a choir held a single sustained note that seemed to vibrate in the stone itself, and beneath it, quieter, the rustle of silk and fur as half the pack's ruling families shifted in their seats, waiting. Vivienne stood at the altar in white silk heavy enough to be armor, and counted candles instead of looking at any of them. It gave her hands something to do besides shake. 41 along the left transept, 38 along the right, one snuffed early by a draft nobody else had noticed. She had learned long ago that numbers didn't lie to her the way faces did. Above her, in the dark where the light didn't reach, something shifted, a fold of shadow against shadow, gone before she could be certain she'd seen it. She didn't imagine things anymore. 18 years had trained that habit out of her. The exact difference between a shadow that belonged in a room and one that didn't was the first thing she'd ever learned to read, long before she'd learned to read anything else. She kept her eyes forward. Looking up would tell the wrong people she'd noticed, so she let her gaze settle instead on the priest's hands, folded and patient, and did not let so much as a flicker of her attention betray what she'd seen in the rafters. Beside her stood a man in the king's spymaster black, spine straight, jaw locked, giving a convincing impression of someone who felt nothing at all standing this close to her. She was near enough to catch the single muscle ticking at his temple, and to know exactly what it cost him to hold still. His hands, folded in front of him with soldierly precision, were closer to hers than court propriety strictly allowed. Neither of them had moved to correct that. Neither of them intended to. Her aunt had come to her only minutes before the procession began, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from Vivienne's veil, with the proprietary affection of a woman admiring something she'd finished building. "You look lovely," she'd said, in the same voice she'd used for 18 years, warm on the surface and entirely without curiosity underneath it. "Try not to look so nervous. A king doesn't want a bride who trembles." "I'll try," Vivienne had said, and let her voice waver exactly enough to be believed, and watched her aunt's face soften with satisfaction at having steadied a foolish girl one last time. She had smiled at that woman for 18 years. She would smile at her tonight, too. It was the last night she would ever have to. The priest lifted both hands. "We gather to witness a binding that will secure the future of this pack." Witness. Something moved behind her ribs, sharp enough to steal a breath, if any of them understood what they were actually about to witness. And so, as is tradition older than this hall itself, the assembly will now honor the rite of the unseen vow. A ripple went through the pews, an old custom, rarely invoked. Every guest straightened slightly, pleased to be present for something their grandparents had only described secondhand. Somewhere behind her, Vivienne heard her aunt murmur to a neighboring dignitary, something about how fortunate it was that the old ways hadn't been entirely lost, how meaningful it would be to say they'd stood in this hall the night it was honored again. She had spent 18 years learning to hear everything and answer to none of it. Tonight, of all nights, that skill mattered more than it ever had. Lord Devereux sat in the front pew with the particular stillness of a man rehearsing his own triumph in advance. His wife's fingers were laced through his, knuckles pale with anticipation rather than nerves. They had waited 18 years for a night exactly like this one. Nothing in their posture suggested they suspected it would not be the night they expected. "Turn," the priest said, "and let this vow be spoken beyond witness." The cathedral turned its back, hundreds of bodies rotating as one, human envoys and wolf-pack lords and her own family among them, believing they honored a bride's binding to their king. Somewhere in that turning, Vivienne caught the specific shape of her uncle's shoulders, already relaxed, already certain of a victory he believed was minutes from being sealed. For one suspended second, Vivienne stood in a hall full of turned backs, feeling more exposed than she had ever felt hiding behind a mask. 18 years of being watched by people who saw nothing, and now, in the one moment that actually mattered, no one was watching at all. The man beside her turned to face her instead. Whatever was about to happen in that blind, silent window would not be seen by anyone but the two of them. Above them, in the dark, something that had been waiting far longer than either of them knew, waited a little longer still. 18 years earlier, Lady Seraphina Devereux had broken the one rule her family valued above blood. She had loved a man they could not trace, could not trade, and could not control, and carried his child to term inside a body they no longer trusted to be theirs. An unnamed bloodline was worse to them than no bloodline at all, so for the length of her pregnancy, they had chained her to a dungeon wall at the far end of their estate, certain that suffering would break her silence before the birth ever could. It never did. The cell smelled of stone and old blood, though Vivienne was 6 and didn't have words yet for either. She knew the dark and the cold and the way her mother's hands trembled around hers. Somewhere above them, through a grate too high to reach, a single thread of moonlight fell across the floor and never quite reached where they sat. Vivienne, Seraphina's voice cracked, urgent, nothing like the soft lullaby tone she used in daylight when guards were watching and pretending not to. "Listen to me. We don't have long." Vivienne remembered, even years later, the specific way her mother's breathing had changed in those final minutes. Shallow, quick, the breathing of someone doing arithmetic against a clock only she could hear. Something pressed into her palm, small, hard-edged. Obsidian, she'd learned to call the stone years later, carved into a wolf's head with a single ruby eye. It was still warm from where her mother had kept it hidden against her own skin, and 6-year-old Vivienne closed her fingers around it, the way she might have closed them around anything precious enough to be worth guarding with her life, without yet understanding why it deserved that. "You are not Devereux," her mother whispered, and even at 6, Vivienne understood this was a sentence that could kill them both if the wrong ears heard it. "Your father is a powerful man. One day he will know you exist." Her grip tightened, desperate. "You survive until then, however you have to, whatever you have to become." "Mama," Vivienne started, and didn't get to finish because a boot scraped stone somewhere down the corridor, and her mother's whole body went rigid with a fear Vivienne had never seen on her before. "No more questions," Seraphina breathed. "Just remember, whatever they tell you, whatever they call you, remember what I told you tonight." By morning, the cell was empty. No body, no explanation. Just a 6-year-old standing very still in a hallway of adults telling her, in careful rehearsed voices, that her mother had died of a fever in the night. She did not cry in front of them. She had already learned, in those few hours alone in the dark, exactly what it cost to let the wrong people see her grieve. She remembered instead standing very still, letting her face go slack and confused, watching the adults exchange glances over her head, as though she were too young to understand what had just been decided in that hallway. It was the old nurse, Mabel, who found her hours later curled in the corner of the nursery, not crying, simply staring at the obsidian pendant in her palm, as though it might explain something the adults refused to. Mabel had said nothing about fevers. She'd simply gathered Vivienne into her arms, held her the way no one else in that house ever quite managed to afterward, and murmured against her hair, "Whatever you become, little one, you become it on purpose. Never let them decide it for you." Vivienne never told her, in all the years that followed, exactly how much that single sentence had shaped everything she built afterward. Some debts were better carried quietly, so she built something else instead. Clumsy hands, a slow, confused smile, a girl too simple to watch closely, too harmless to matter. She practiced it in mirrors, and in front of servants, and in front of the family who had killed her mother, and would spend the next 18 years believing they were shaping her into exactly what they wanted. She practiced dropping things she could have caught. She practiced forgetting names she remembered perfectly. She practiced, most of all, the particular vacant warmth of a smile that told everyone in the room she posed no threat to anyone at all. She never once let them see underneath it, not even when it would have been easier to. At 8, she dropped a favorite hairpin down a stairwell on purpose and cried real tears over the loss of it, because real tears over something small bought her the freedom to never cry over anything that actually mattered. At 12, she let her tutor believe she couldn't grasp simple sums, and spent her evenings afterward, alone, working through the estate's ledgers by candlelight until she understood exactly how much of her family's wealth had been built on land seized from families who'd crossed them, and exactly which of those families might one day be worth remembering. At 15, Lord Devereux himself had called her sweetly simple in front of a visiting dignitary, and patted her head the way one might pat a favored hound. She had smiled and curtsied, and later that night memorized the dignitary's name, his territory, and the exact tone of contempt in Lord Devereux's voice when he thought no one worth impressing was listening. By 17, she had catalogued every lie her family told about her mother, every guard who'd been paid to forget what he'd seen, every servant who flinched slightly whenever Seraphina's name came up in conversation and quickly changed the subject. She kept all of it the way some people kept jewelry, carefully, privately, waiting for the one day it might finally be spent. She had rehearsed the walk to that hall 100 times in her mind, and none of the rehearsals had prepared her for how long the actual corridor felt, torches guttering along stone walls, her own footsteps far too loud beneath the veil that hid everything but her eyes. She had spent 18 years learning to disappear into a room. Tonight she had to do the opposite, and every instinct she'd built screamed against it. That night, the king was already in private session with the 5 elders of the royal council, the oldest guardians of the kingdom's laws. They had been debating a matter of state for nearly an hour when a palace guard entered, bowed deeply, and interrupted the discussion. "Your Majesty," the guard said carefully, "a veiled young woman has arrived at the palace gates. She claims to possess proof that she is of royal blood and requests an audience." A brief silence settled over the chamber. The elders exchanged puzzled glances. False claimants were hardly unusual, but few dared make such a claim directly before the throne. "Bring her in," the king said at last. She had walked into the king's private hall veiled, and the eyes of the 5 elders in the room watched her, the way courts always watch strangers, suspicion dressed as courtesy. Whispers moved through the 5 assembled elders before she'd taken 3 steps. Who was she? Whose sponsorship had gotten her this audience? What she could possibly want badly enough to risk the king's famous impatience with false claims? She had heard worse whispers for 18 years. These barely registered, every eye but one. The spy master at the king's right hand did not watch her the way the others did. He watched the way a man watches something he has waited a very long time to see confirmed. She noticed him before she noticed anything else in that hall, not because he was watching her, though he was, but because of how he was watching her, with an intensity that had nothing to do with suspicion at all. The king himself sat forward in his seat, older than she'd expected, his face carrying the particular weariness of a ruler who has outlasted most of the people he once trusted. "Approach," he said, not unkindly, though the word carried the impatience of a man who had turned away a great many false claimants before her. She crossed the remaining distance and stopped exactly where the guard's spears indicated she should, close enough to be seen clearly, far enough to be no threat. "Your Majesty," Vivienne drew the pendant from beneath her collar into the torchlight. Cool obsidian, the ruby eye-catching flame, and even after 18 years locked away in a drawer, She could still remember exactly how warm it had felt the night her mother pressed it into her hand. The king went very still. "Where?" he said, in a voice gone suddenly quiet. "Did you get that?" The whole hall seemed to hold its breath along with him. "My mother gave it to me, the night before she died." She held his gaze, though her pulse was hammering hard enough to hear. "She told me my father was a powerful man, and that one day he would know I existed." For a long moment the king didn't move at all. Then his hand rose, slow, unsteady, a king's composure cracking in a way his court had likely never once witnessed, and lifted her veil. A murmur went through the elders, quickly hushed. Whatever they had expected walking into that hall tonight, it plainly was not this. He looked at her the way a man looks at a debt he never expected to be allowed to repay. "Seraphina," he said, and the name came apart in his mouth. "You have her eyes." For a moment he seemed to forget entirely that his court was watching. An old king, undone in front of the very nobles who had spent decades believing him unshakable. Then, visibly, he gathered himself, straightened, and turned to the hall with the particular authority of a man reclaiming his composure by force of will alone. "Leave us," he said. "All of you, and I forbid any of you to speak about this event. It never occurred." The 5 assembled elders bowed and left with a secret they can never speak about, and only the spymaster remained, exactly where duty required him to, though nothing in his stance suggested duty was the only reason. Alone with her, the king's composure slipped further, not less. 18 years, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I looked for her, you know, quietly. I never found so much as a grave." His hand hovered near her face, not quite touching, as though he feared she might vanish the way her mother had. "Tell me you were safe. Tell me they were at least good to you." Vivienne considered for a moment, giving him the answer that would spare him the truth. She chose not to. "They called me foolish," she said. "For 18 years, it kept me alive." Something in the king's face broke a second time, differently than the first. "Then I owe you 18 years I can never give back," he said, "and I intend to spend whatever I have left trying anyway." Behind him, the spymaster hadn't moved, but Vivienne felt his attention the whole time. Waited, deliberate, and when she finally met his gaze directly, something passed between them she had no name for yet. He knew her, not knew of her, knew her the way a man recognizes the child whose face has haunted his memory for 12 long years. "Damon Ashworth," the king said, gesturing him forward without looking away from her. "My spymaster. He'll see to your safety while we sort out what comes next." Damon stepped forward and inclined his head, formal, correct, every inch the disciplined soldier the court expected. "Your Highness." But his eyes, lifting to hers again, held something the formal words hadn't touched, the look of a man who has just found something he thought he'd lost before he ever truly had it. 18 years of building a mask no one had ever seen through, and this stranger had looked at her once, and seen straight past it. She would spend the following weeks telling herself it meant nothing, that a spymaster's attention was simply a spymaster's training, that any man in his position would look twice at an unexplained claimant to the throne. She almost believed it, some nights. Other nights, lying awake in a room in the king's own keep for the first time in her life, she found herself turning his gaze over in her memory the way she once turned over her mother's last words, searching for a meaning she wasn't yet ready to name. He knows something he shouldn't. 12 years earlier, Damon Ashworth was 16 years old and 3 months into training when he took a patrol route he had no business taking, along the edge of the Devereux estate, because a superior officer had waved him off with directions too vague to be useful, and he'd been too proud to ask twice. The night was cold enough to see his own breath, the estate's outer wall looming pale under a thin moon, and he remembered thinking, in the last ordinary moment before everything changed, that he'd need to double back before anyone noticed he'd wandered this far from his assigned route. He heard the crying first, a thin, exhausted sound, the kind that had been going on so long it had worn down to something almost mechanical. He followed it without deciding to, the way you follow any sound that doesn't belong in a place that's supposed to be quiet. Then he saw her, small, dragged by the wrist down a dungeon stairwell by men twice her size, her face a wreck of confusion and grief too young to know how to hide yet. He didn't move, didn't call out. Some instinct older than his training told him that whatever this was, announcing himself would only make it worse for the child, not better. He pressed himself into the shadow of the wall instead, close enough to hear, and made himself watch, because some part of him already understood that someone needed to. An hour later, a window went dark, and stayed dark. He stood there a long time after that, in the cold, trying to convince himself he'd witnessed nothing more than a family disciplining a servant's child, or some private grief that was none of his business. He didn't believe it. He hadn't believed it since the moment he saw her face. He reported it, not to his commanding officer, but to the Alpha King directly, breaking 3 ranks of protocol to do it, because something in him refused to let a crying child and a darkened window pass as politics the way everyone else around him seemed prepared to. He remembered his hands shaking as he gave his account, remembered expecting to be dismissed for insubordination before he'd even finished the sentence. The king listened without interrupting. When Damon finished, the silence stretched long enough that Damon assumed he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment and would be dismissed from service by morning. "What's your name?" the king said instead. "Damon Ashworth, your majesty." The king studied him for a long moment, not the way a ruler studies a soldier, but the way a man studies something unexpected he isn't yet sure what to do with. "Report to my personal training master starting tomorrow," the king said. "Tell no one why." Damon never understood, for years afterward, why a king with no heir of his own took such deliberate interest in one recruit's education. He only knew that he never once stopped seeing that child's face on nights when sleep didn't come easily, and that 12 years of dagger work, court politics, and the particular art of reading a room before it turned dangerous never managed to dislodge her from wherever she'd lodged herself in him. He didn't know he was being built into a king's successor. He only knew he'd never forgotten her. The day the king introduced them properly, Damon had known her for exactly 1 conversation and had already decided it was going to be a problem. He'd spent the morning telling himself otherwise, that whatever he'd felt in that hall when she lifted her veil was simple recognition, nothing more, the closing of a question that had sat unanswered in him for 12 years. He believed that story for almost the length of the walk from his quarters to the training yard. It didn't survive seeing her again in daylight. "You'll guard her," the king said, in the tone he used for orders that weren't actually requests. "Train her. She has 18 years of pretending to be someone she isn't to unlearn, and precious little time to do it in." Vivienne stood a few feet away, veil finally lowered, watching Damon with the same unreadable calm she'd worn the moment she'd lifted it. Though up close, he could see the calm cost her something to maintain. A woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated didn't relax simply because someone finally believed her. He recognized that particular vigilance. He'd worn a version of it himself, most of his life. "I don't need a babysitter," she said, once the king had gone and left them alone in the training yard. "Good," Damon said. "I wasn't planning to be one." Her eyebrow lifted, faint challenge. "Then what were you planning to be?" "Thorough." He nodded toward the practice blades racked against the far wall. "Pick one." She picked the smallest one, deliberately, testing him. "Wrong choice," he said. "You're not small. You've just spent 18 years convincing people you are. Pick the one that actually fits your reach." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, quickly smoothed away, but he'd caught it before she could hide it. He was getting good at that. Too good, if he was honest with himself, at noticing the half-second before Vivienne remembered to be careful. She picked a longer blade the second time, better balance, better instinct than she was giving herself credit for. "You've held a weapon before," Damon said. "Not a question." "I've held plenty of things I wasn't supposed to know how to hold," Vivienne said. "Being underestimated has its uses." He believed her instantly, and found, inconveniently, that he liked her for it. It was, he would think later, the exact moment he stopped being able to pretend this assignment was simple duty and nothing more. Training sessions accumulated into weeks, then months. Damon taught her dagger grips and how to read a room full of people who wanted her dead without letting any of them see her notice. She taught him, without meaning to, that the woman underneath 18 years of careful foolishness was sharper, funnier, and considerably more dangerous than anyone at court had ever guessed, including, some days, Damon himself. There was a particular afternoon, weeks into her training, when she'd finally landed a strike he hadn't seen coming, not because she'd grown faster than him, but because she'd learned, watching him for weeks, exactly which of his tells to ignore and which to trust. She'd stood over him afterward, breathing hard, more delighted with herself than he'd ever seen her allow herself to be in front of anyone else. "You're going to gloat," he'd said, from the ground. "I'm absolutely going to gloat." "You flinch," she told him another day, midway through a sparring session, "when I get too close to your left side." "I don't flinch." "You absolutely flinch." She circled him, testing the observation, and he hated that she was right. Old injury, old habit. He caught her wrist mid-strike, more to stop the conversation than the blade. "Focus. I am focused." Her eyes, close enough now that he could count the flecks of gold in them, didn't waver. "I'm focused on the fact that you're deflecting." "You're focused," Damon said, "on losing this match, if you keep talking instead of defending." She laughed, an actual laugh, unguarded, nothing like the careful smiles she wore for the court, and the sound did something to his chest that 12 years of discipline hadn't prepared him for at all. He should have requested a transfer that night. He knew it even as he didn't. The assassin came for him on a Tuesday, in a corridor he'd walked 1,000 times, and Damon never saw the blade until it was already past the point where he could have stopped it. He would replay the moment often in the weeks afterward, the ordinary torchlight, the ordinary echo of his own footsteps, nothing in the corridor that should have warned him of anything at all. Vivienne saw it first. She didn't call out a warning. There wasn't time, and some instinct honed by 18 years of watching rooms for exactly this kind of threat moved her before her own mind caught up to what she was doing. She threw herself between Damon and the blade and took the shallow cut across her forearm that had been meant for his throat. The assassin didn't get a second attempt. Damon made certain of that, moving on pure reflex once his mind caught up to what his eyes had already seen. Her blood, bright against the stone, and the sudden white-hot clarity of exactly how close he'd come to losing her before he'd let himself admit what she was to him. Afterward, in the physician's quarters, with her arm bandaged and her face gone pale from blood loss rather than fear, Vivienne looked up at him with an expression he'd never seen her wear before. Not for the court, not for her family, not even for him until this exact moment. "You could have died," Damon said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "So could you. That's not the same thing. Isn't it?" She held his gaze, steady despite the blood she'd lost. "You've spent 6 months teaching me I'm allowed to matter to someone. You don't get to be surprised when I act like it." Damon had no answer for that. He sat with her instead, until the physician finally made him leave, and did not examine too closely why the thought of losing her had frightened him more than any threat against his own life ever had. The king found out within the hour. He said nothing to either of them about it directly. But 2 days later, he summoned Damon alone, and told him, in the plain, unhurried voice of a man revealing a plan that had been assembling itself for months, precisely what he intended to do about a proposal the Devereux family was about to receive. Lord Devereux read the letter twice before he permitted himself to smile. His wife had gone very still beside him at the long table, waiting, and when he finally looked up, his face had taken on the bright, unguarded look of a man who has just watched 18 years of patience pay out at once. "Read it," he said, and slid the letter across to her. Her eyes moved down the page. A binding between the Alpha King and Lady Vivienne, formalized before the full court to secure the succession of the realm. Her hand came up to her mouth. "He's asking for her," she said, disbelieving. "The king himself. An old man with no heir," Lord Devereux said, "and no time left to be particular about the terms." He poured wine for both of them, hands not quite steady. "We raised her exactly for this. Obedient, unclaimed, nothing anyone could trace back to complicate a bloodline." He lifted his glass. 18 years, and the throne walks into our hands without us raising a finger for it. "And once she bears an heir?" his wife asked, quieter now, though her eyes were bright. "Then nature takes its course, the way it always does with old men." He didn't need to say more than that. They both understood precisely what he meant, and neither flinched from it. A regent infant, an obedient young widow who has never once resisted us in her life. "We rule through both of them for as long as we need to." His wife smiled properly then, the first real smile Vivienne had ever managed to earn from her in 18 years of trying. "And the spy master? He's to guard her in the meantime?" A jealous husband posting his own man close to his bride. Lord Devereux waved a hand, already bored with the question. "Let him watch her, it changes nothing. She'll do just as she's always done." He raised his glass again, toward a daughter who wasn't in the room to hear any of it. "To the throne, delivered." His wife raised her own glass to meet his, and for a moment they sat together in the particular satisfaction of people who believe every remaining variable in their favor has already been accounted for. They spoke, briefly, of the wedding to come, the guest list, the appropriate display of the family's restored standing, the small matter of announcing the match to the wider pack before rumor could beat them to it. Not once did either of them wonder why an old king who had never before shown interest in remarriage had suddenly decided, after decades of solitude, that this particular season was the season to take a bride. Neither of them thought to ask why the king's spy master had been guarding her for 6 months before the proposal ever arrived. The wedding morning had arrived. Vivienne stood once more at the exact altar where this story had begun. The same candles burned down closer to their wax pools now, the same hall gathered, the same held breath before the same ancient rite. Only now she carried the weight of everything that had brought her back to this precise moment. Damon stood beside her, not behind her, close enough that his sleeve nearly brushed hers. They had spoken only once, alone, in the hour before the procession began, a stolen handful of minutes in a side chamber where no one thought to look for either of them. He had straightened the collar of his ceremonial black, unnecessarily, simply to have a reason to stand close to her one last time before the hall filled with witnesses who weren't meant to understand what they were witnessing. "Second thoughts?" he'd asked her then, quiet. "And this time I mean it." "None," she'd said. "You? I stopped having second thoughts about you long before today." He'd almost smiled, the rare, unguarded version she'd learned to watch for. "Ready?" "No," she'd said. "Let's do it anyway. Last chance to change your mind," he said now, low enough that only she could hear it. "Is that an offer?" A formality. The corner of his mouth moved, barely. "I already know what you're going to say. Say it anyway," she told him, "before I lose my nerve." The priest raised his hands once more and gave the same ancient command that had opened the ceremony. "Turn, and let this vow be spoken beyond witness." The hall turned its back. Damon turned to face her instead. "I, Damon Ashworth," he said, low and certain, his hand finding hers in the blind, unwitnessed dark, "take you, Vivienne Aldrich Blackwood, not Devereux, never Devereux, as my wife. Not because a king ordered it, not because a kingdom requires it." His thumb moved once over her knuckles. Because I have known you were mine to protect since you were 6 years old, crying in the dark, and I have wanted you to be mine to love since the day you stopped needing me to. Something in Vivienne's chest, coiled tight for 18 years, came loose. I, Vivienne, daughter of King Aldrich Blackwood and Seraphina Devereux, she said, and her voice did not shake, take you, Damon Ashworth, as my husband, not the king's bride, not Devereux's obedient daughter. She lifted her chin. My mother died, so that one day someone would say my name and mean me. You are the first person who has. Sealed, Damon said. Sealed, she echoed. And the hall turned back around. The priest's satisfied nod came first, believing the rite complete exactly as expected. Then confusion, small at first, a furrowed brow, an exchanged glance, as the assembled court registered that the woman at the altar was not standing where a new-made royal bride should stand, that the king himself sat in the front pew, where a father watches his daughter marry, not where a groom waits for his bride. A noblewoman 2 rows back leaned toward her neighbor, whispering something about the arrangement of the altar. A young lord near the aisle frowned at the empty space where the king should have stood, then at Damon, then back again, visibly working through an equation that refused to balance. The hall's collective certainty, so absolute only moments before, had already begun to fracture into 100 private confusions before anyone dared say the doubt aloud. Lord Devereux's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Where, he said, very carefully, into the silence, is His Majesty's place at this altar? Vivienne reached up and tore the veil from her face. For 18 years this same hall had looked at her and seen exactly what she'd built them to see, a girl too foolish to be worth watching closely. Now, in the space of a single breath, every face in that cathedral rearranged itself around a version of her none of them had ever let themselves imagine. Above them, in the rafters, where the candlelight didn't reach, a hand lifted, small, deliberate, fingers spread, a signal meant for eyes that had been waiting, patient and paid, for exactly one thing, confirmation that the bride sealed at that altar had been named, before witnesses, as Devereux blood. Confirmation had just failed. Damon's hand shot toward his blade a half-second too late. Above them, bowstrings drew taut in the dark. The first arrow took the priest through the shoulder. He went down mid-word, the blessing he'd been reciting dissolving into a sound no one in that cathedral would forget by morning. And for one frozen half-second the entire hall simply stared, too stunned by the sight of blood on marble to understand yet that more was coming. Damon understood immediately. He always did. Down. His hand closed around Vivienne's wrist and pulled her behind the altar's stone base, a heartbeat before the second volley loosed from the rafters. Not one archer, she realized with a cold drop in her stomach, but several, positioned wide enough to cover every angle of escape from the altar. Weeks of preparation. Not desperation. Insurance, the way her family had always done everything. Screaming erupted through the pews. Guests who moments ago had turned their backs in solemn ceremony, now scattered in every direction, courtiers diving beneath benches, wolves shifting mid-panic in flashes of fur and fear. The king's personal guard surged forward from the cathedral's edges, but the archers had the higher ground and the element of chaos on their side, and for several long seconds it was not at all clear which way the night would break. A young noblewoman froze in the center aisle, too stunned by the sight of the fallen priest to remember how to run, exactly in the path of the third volley loosing from above. "Move!" Vivienne was already moving before the word finished leaving her mouth, closing the distance faster than 18 years of feigned clumsiness had ever suggested she could, and shoved the girl sideways into the shelter of a pew a breath before the arrows found empty marble where she'd been standing. There was no time to explain, and no time for the girl's wide-eyed disbelief at the woman who had just saved her. The same woman half the court still thought too foolish to be trusted with her own wedding veil. Stay down. Stay behind stone, Vivienne told her, and was already moving again. Stay down, Damon said, already rising into a crouch, blade drawn. I didn't spend 18 years learning to survive so I could hide behind an altar, Vivienne said, and drew the dagger from beneath her skirts that she'd kept strapped to her thigh since the day Damon first taught her never to walk into a room unarmed, even in silk, even at her own wedding. He didn't argue. There wasn't time, and some part of him, the part that had watched her step between him and a blade once already, knew better than to expect her to. They moved together, low and fast, toward the king. He'd risen from the front pew, despite his guards' attempts to shield him, because 18 years of waiting for this daughter had apparently taught him the same stubborn disregard for his own safety that she'd learned from her mother. An arrow grazed his shoulder as he turned, and he staggered, catching himself against the pew's edge. "Get him clear," Damon shouted to the nearest guard, already cutting a path through the chaos toward the archer's access point, a narrow servant's stair Vivienne had noticed weeks ago and mentioned to him almost as an afterthought, never imagining it would matter this much, this fast. Vivienne reached her father as a fourth guard fell, an arrow finding the gap in his armor. "You should be running," the king said, breath tight with pain, blood already darkening his ceremonial robes at the shoulder. "So should you." She got an arm under him, steadying more of his weight than she expected a man his size to need her for, and understood in that moment, with a clarity that arrived far too late to be useful, exactly how much the illness he'd hidden from his court had already cost him before an arrow ever touched him. Behind them, near the base of the altar, Lord Devereux stood frozen amid the chaos he had ordered, but plainly not expected to witness firsthand. His wife clutched his arm, face bloodless, staring up at the rafters where the men she'd paid to guarantee her family's future were currently trying to kill the only version of that future actually left standing. "Call them off," Vivienne said, loud enough to carry, dragging her father toward the relative shelter of a side chapel. "Call them off now, or you hang for every single one of us who dies here tonight, including your own." "I never," Lord Devereux's voice cracked, the first crack in 18 years of composure. "This wasn't meant to happen this way. This wasn't the plan." "It was exactly the plan," Vivienne said. "You simply expected it to work in your favor." Above them, Damon had reached the servant's stair, and the sound that followed, steel against steel, a cry cut short, a body striking stone, told her he'd found the first of them. Lord Devereux, in the chaos of it, did the only thing 18 years of careful ambition had ever really prepared him to do when a plan collapsed. He tried to run. He broke from his wife's grip and made for the side door nearest the vestry, moving with a speed that belied his age and his usual composure both, only to find it already blocked by two of the king's guard, who had, until this exact hour, still called him lord and answered to his household summons without question. "Stand aside," Lord Devereux said, breathless, imperious out of pure habit even now. Neither guard moved. "I said stand aside." His voice cracked on the second attempt, the first genuine fear either soldier had ever heard from him. "Not tonight, my lord," the elder of the two said, not unkindly, and it was that flat, ordinary refusal, not the arrows, not his daughter's fury, not even the sight of his own wife's terror, that seemed to finally break something loose in Lord Devereux's understanding of exactly how completely his world had already ended. The second archer very nearly killed him. Damon took the stairs two at a time into a narrow gallery strung between the rafters, dust and old rope and the acrid smell of tallow smoke thick in the air, and found not one man waiting for him there but two, the first already knocking another arrow toward the chaos below, the second turning at the sound of his boots on the gallery boards. He took the second man first, fast and brutal, before the man's blade had even fully cleared its sheath. There was no room in a fight like this for fairness, only for finishing things before they became worse. The first archer abandoned his bow the instant he understood the odds had changed, and drew a blade of his own instead, faster than the last one had any right to be. A professional, not a desperate hire, someone who'd clearly done this kind of work before and expected to walk away from it again. The first strike nearly took Damon's arm off at the elbow. He turned it aside barely in time, the blade skating along his forearm instead, opening a shallow line of fire he didn't have the luxury of feeling yet. "Should have taken the transfer," the archer said, almost conversational, circling. "The king offered you a way out of this. Man who turns down that kind of mercy usually has his reasons." "I had my reasons," Damon said, and drove forward before the man finished the sentence, using the half-second of talk as exactly the opening it was meant to be. They went down together, grappling for the narrow space between rope and rafter beam, 20 feet above stone floor with nothing beneath them but a very long fall and the screaming chaos of a wedding turned battlefield. Damon's knee found the man's ribs. The man's elbow found Damon's jaw hard enough to see stars. For one vertiginous second, Damon's grip slipped on the rope, and the fall opened beneath him like a mouth. Then his other hand caught the beam, white-knuckled, and he hauled himself back over the edge in time to catch the second strike aimed at his throat on the flat of his blade, close enough that he felt the archer's breath. "Should have taken it," the man said again, softer now, tiring. "Wouldn't have mattered," Damon said. "I was never leaving her." He ended it there, quick and final, and didn't let himself think again about how close the fall had come to ending something else entirely. By the time Damon made it back down into the main hall, the worst of the chaos had begun to settle into something more like a standoff. 3 archers dead or captured. A 4th had fled across the rooftops and would be hunted down before morning. The King's Guard had regained control of the doors, sealing the cathedral, and no one, least of all the Devereux family, now surrounded on all sides by soldiers who had, until tonight, called them lords, was going anywhere. The cathedral itself bore the marks of what had happened in it: overturned pews, a scorch mark where a dropped candle had caught the edge of a tapestry before someone smothered it, the priest carried out on a makeshift litter, alive but gray with pain. Guests who had come dressed for celebration now stood in torn silk and disheveled fur along the walls, too shaken to leave, too curious to look away from what was clearly about to happen at the altar their entire understanding of the night had just been rebuilt around. Vivienne stood at the center of it all, her father steadied against the side chapel wall, blood soaking through the bandage a physician had hastily applied to his shoulder, and looked at the family that had raised her to be handed away like currency. 18 years, she said, and her voice, though quiet, carried through the wreckage of the cathedral the way only true authority ever manages to. 18 years of smiling at the people who murdered my mother. 18 years of being called clumsy, foolish, harmless, because it was easier for you to believe that than to imagine what I actually was. "Vivienne," her aunt started, "whatever you believe happened. I was 6 years old," Vivienne said, "when I watched from a hallway while you told me she died of a fever. I have known exactly what happened to her since the night it happened. I simply chose not to let you see me know it." She looked at each of them in turn, her aunt, her uncle, Lord Devereux himself, his composure now in complete ruins. "You didn't raise an obedient daughter, you raised a witness, and tonight that witness has a throne, a husband, and an army standing between you and any door out of this building." Damon reached her side, blood on his sleeve, breathing hard, and said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence beside her did the talking his silence chose not to. Lord Devereux found something of himself one last time, the old arrogance, thin and desperate now, surfacing for a final attempt. "You can't do this," he said, "not to your own family." "I already have," Vivienne said. "Guards," she said. "Take them." It happened fast after that, the way collapses often do once the first crack finally gives way. Lord Devereux's titles stripped in the same hall where he'd once celebrated his daughter's supposed surrender. his holdings seized before the sun rose. His wife's jewelry, much of it, Vivienne would learn later, purchased with money meant for her mother's care during a pregnancy spent chained to a dungeon wall, confiscated piece by piece in front of a court that had once bowed to this family without question. One by one, distant cousins and household stewards who had known and said nothing came forward, unprompted, offering testimony they'd swallowed for 18 years in exchange for whatever leniency their honesty might buy them. It was not mercy that moved Vivienne to grant most of them lighter sentences than their silence had earned. It was recognizing, in each confession, an echo of her own 18 years of surviving by staying quiet, though she made certain every one of them understood the difference between silence born of fear and silence chosen for convenience. Every single member of the Devereux line who had known, who had participated, who had simply looked away while a woman died and a child learned to disappear, named, individually, in front of witnesses who would carry the story of that night for the rest of their lives. The king did not survive the month. The arrow wound healed cleanly enough, but the illness beneath it, the one he'd hidden from his court for longer than anyone but his personal physician knew, had been waiting for exactly this kind of excuse to finally win. He held on long enough to see his daughter's throne secured beyond any legal challenge, long enough to watch the Devereux family's holdings redistributed to those they'd wronged, long enough, he told Vivienne quietly one evening near the end, to feel like a father instead of only a king. She spent those final weeks learning him the way she'd once learned every room she'd ever had to survive. Not out of caution this time, but because she wanted, badly, to know everything about him before there was no more time left to ask. She learned that he hummed without noticing when he was pleased, that he still slept, some nights, with a small portrait of a woman whose name he never once said aloud in Vivienne's hearing, though she suspected she knew exactly whose face it was. That he asked, more than once, careful and almost shy about it, what her mother had been like as a girl, as though 18 years of separation could be partially undone simply by hearing enough small details secondhand. "I had 12 years with Damon," he said, propped against pillows that had grown too large for him these last weeks, his voice thinner than it had been even a month before. "I only had a season with you. I would have liked more." "You gave me more than I expected to have at all," Vivienne said, holding his hand the way she'd never gotten to hold her mother's. Not once, not since she was 6 years old in a cell that smelled of stone and old blood. "That has to be enough." "It is," the king said, and something in his face eased, the peace of a man who has finally set down a weight he carried farther than anyone should have to. "Tell me you'll rule as no one's shadow. Not mine, not the pack's expectations, not anyone's." "I will," she promised. He died 2 nights later, his hand in hers, Damon's hand resting over both of theirs, and his final words were not about the throne, or the succession, or the 18 years of careful planning that had brought them to this moment. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me be her father, even for a little while." Vivienne mourned him the way she had never once been allowed to mourn her mother, openly, in daylight, without a mask left standing between her grief and the people who witnessed it. The court that had once called her foolish watched their new queen weep at her father's bier, and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the woman they'd underestimated for 18 years had never once stopped feeling everything she'd learned to hide. The coronation took place in the same cathedral, though this time every candle burned in plain sight, and every face in the hall stayed turned toward the altar rather than away from it. The scorch marks had been repaired, the pews stood straight again. Only the memory of that night remained, etched into every guest who had lived through it and would carry the story, in one version or another, for the rest of their lives. Vivienne climbed the same steps she'd climbed on her wedding night, to the same throne the Devereux family had never once thought to question, and this time there was no veil left to remove, no mask left to wear, nothing left standing between the woman she'd always been and the crown finally settling where it had always belonged. Damon stood beside her, not behind her. "Some of you remember the night this began," she told the assembled court, her voice carrying easily now, no trace left of the careful, clumsy foolishness she'd spent 18 years perfecting. "You remember turning your backs at my wedding, believing you witnessed one thing, while an entirely different truth was sealed in the dark behind you. Some truths only survive because no one is watching closely enough to stop them." She reached for Damon's hand, and he gave it without hesitation, as he always had. "I spent 18 years letting this pack believe I was harmless, because it was the only way to survive long enough to become anything else," Vivienne said. "I will not spend the rest of my life pretending again. I rule beside no one's shadow, not my family's expectations, not a crown's demands, not even the memory of everyone this family tried to erase before me. And I do not rule alone." The hall did not turn its back this time. Every face remained fixed on the throne. No whispers, no doubt. No one looking over a shoulder to see which way power had shifted, because for the first time in 18 years, power stood openly before them. The girl they had dismissed as foolish, the child they had abandoned to darkness, the bride they believed they could use to seize a throne, had become the queen before whom every one of them now bowed. The great bells of the cathedral began to ring. Once, twice, then again. Their echoes rolled across the capital, over crowded streets, through marketplaces, across the castle walls, carrying the same message farther than any royal decree ever could. The house of Devereux had fallen. A new reign had begun. Vivienne looked toward the great cathedral doors, where sunlight poured across the marble floor. For a fleeting heartbeat, she imagined she could see her mother standing there, not as a ghost, but as a memory finally allowed to rest. No chains, no darkness, no fear, only peace. She closed her eyes. "You're free now, Mama." When she opened her eyes again, the sunlight had swallowed the doorway. There was no one there. She smiled anyway. Some promises did not need witnesses. Then she turned toward her kingdom, and she never looked back. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Tales by Crimson Moon, and tell me in the comments, at what moment did you realize Vivienne had never been the helpless girl everyone believed she was? Until our next tale beneath the crimson moon, sleep well, and never underestimate the quiet ones.